Wounded 21 times, he fought off 20 Germans with a knife, becoming one of World War I's greatest heroes. France gave him their highest medal. America gave him nothing, discharged him without noting his injuries, and let him die poor and forgotten. This is the story of Henry Johnson. General John J. Pershing, commander of the American Expeditionary Force, had no intention of letting black soldiers fight. He wanted American forces kept segregated and autonomous, but he faced a problem. The French army desperately needed reinforcements. They were bleeding to death on the Western Front and begged for American troops. Pershing saw an opportunity. He would lend the French his black regiments. This solved two problems. It gave the French the bodies they needed, and it kept black soldiers separate from white American troops. But Pershing went further. He issued a directive to the French military mission, a document that would later be called Secret Information Concerning Black American Troops. In it, he warned the French that black soldiers were inferior, that they lacked civic and professional conscience, that they were a constant menace. He told the French not to treat these men as equals, not to eat with them, not to shake their hands, not to praise them too highly. White American prejudice was being exported to France. The French largely ignored him. The French had their own colonial troops from Africa and the Caribbean. They had fought alongside them for years. They judged soldiers by one measure: could they fight? The French took the 369th, gave them French rifles and helmets, and sent them to the front lines in the Argonne forest. The Americans had used these men as servants. The French would use them as soldiers. On April 15, 1918, the 369th Infantry arrived at their section of the front line trenches in the Champagne region of northeastern France. They were assigned to Outpost 20, a forward observation position on the edge of the Argonne forest. This was not a safe rear position. This was the sharp end, where German raiding parties came in the night to capture prisoners, gather intelligence, and spread terror. Henry Johnson was 25 years old. He stood 5 feet 4 inches tall and weighed 130 pounds. He'd never fired a shot in anger. He'd received minimal combat training, and now he found himself in one of the most dangerous assignments on the Western Front: sentry duty in no man's land. The night of May 14th was quiet, too quiet. Johnson and Needham Roberts, a 17-year-old from Trenton, New Jersey, had drawn the midnight to 4 a.m. shift. They were stationed at a forward observation post, a small position several hundred yards ahead of the main French line. Behind them were their sleeping comrades. In front of them was darkness, barbed wire, and somewhere beyond that, German soldiers. Around 2 a.m., Johnson heard something, a faint metallic sound. Wire cutters. Someone was cutting through the barbed wire that protected their position. He woke Roberts. They strained their eyes into the darkness. Then they saw them, shapes moving in the night. Grey uniforms, German soldiers, a lot of them. The estimates vary, but most accounts suggest at least 20 German soldiers, possibly as many as 36, were converging on their position. This wasn't random. German intelligence had identified this isolated American outpost. They planned to overwhelm it quickly, capture the 2 sentries, and gather intelligence about American troop positions before anyone could respond. It should have been easy. 2 inexperienced Americans, probably asleep, certainly unprepared. A quick, silent strike. Grab them both. Disappear back into no man's land. Standard raiding party tactics. But Henry Johnson wasn't asleep. He could have stayed silent, could have let them approach, could have surrendered immediately rather than resist overwhelming odds. No one would have blamed him. 2 men against 20 or more? Those aren't odds you fight against. Those are odds that mean you're already dead. Johnson threw his grenades first. The explosions lit up the night, brilliant orange flashes that revealed the Germans closing in from multiple directions. Shrapnel tore through the air. Men screamed. Roberts threw his grenades. The Germans scattered but kept coming. They were professionals, experienced soldiers who'd been fighting since 1914. A few grenades wouldn't stop them. Roberts was hit by grenade fragments in his arm and hip. He went down hard, bleeding, unable to fight. Johnson was alone. He fired his French rifle. 3 rounds. That's all the magazine held. 3 shots. He made them count. The first shot hit a German nearly point blank. The man fell, probably dead before he hit the ground. Another German jumped over his body, pistol raised, coming right at Johnson. There was no time to reload. Johnson swung his rifle like a club. Years of hauling luggage, of physical labor, of hard work had built strength into his arms and shoulders. The wooden stock crashed into the German's skull with sickening force. The man went down screaming. Some accounts say he yelled in English, in a New York accent, cursing Johnson. He was likely an immigrant, maybe someone who'd lived in America before the war, someone who'd been recruited or conscripted by Germany and sent to fight. The war was full of these strange ironies. Germans who spoke English, Americans who spoke German, men who might have lived on the same street in peacetime, trying to kill each other in a French forest. Johnson looked back. His worst fear was realized. 2 Germans had grabbed Roberts and were dragging him toward their own lines. If they captured an American soldier, they could interrogate him, learn about unit positions, command structure, strength, everything. Even if Roberts tried to resist interrogation, they had methods, ways of making soldiers talk, and information from the first American prisoners could be invaluable. Johnson couldn't let that happen. Roberts was his responsibility. More than that, Roberts was his brother in arms. They'd trained together, traveled together, stood watch together. You don't abandon your brother. He had one weapon left, a bolo knife, standard army issue, originally designed for chopping through jungle vegetation in the Philippines. 10 inches of sharpened steel with a heavy-weighted blade. It wasn't meant for combat. It was a tool. But in Johnson's hands, at that moment, it became something else. What happened next has been described by various sources, each trying to capture the savagery of hand-to-hand combat. Johnson buried his knife in one German's head. He disemboweled another. Blood everywhere. The Germans who had grabbed Roberts dropped him and turned to face Johnson. He kept coming, slashing, stabbing, even as a German pistol shot hit him, even as bayonets cut into his body, even as he was wounded again and again. Each slash meant something. Believe me, Johnson would later say with characteristic understatement. There wasn't anything so fine about it. Just fought for my life. A rabbit would have done that. But rabbits don't charge into overwhelming odds. Rabbits don't rescue their fallen comrades. Rabbits don't fight for an hour while suffering wound after wound. Johnson's ferocity broke them. The German raiding party had expected to overwhelm 2 isolated, inexperienced American sentries. Instead, they found themselves in a knife fight with someone who refused to stop, refused to fall, refused to die. They could hear French troops stirring behind Johnson's position, responding to the grenade explosions and gunfire. The Germans grabbed their dead and wounded and retreated into the darkness. When French reinforcements arrived minutes later, they found a scene of carnage. Blood everywhere, German equipment scattered across the ground, abandoned weapons, and in the middle of it all, Henry Johnson, still standing, still holding his knife, covered in blood, his own and German. He had been wounded 21 times. Knife cuts, bayonet thrusts, bullet wounds, grenade fragments. His left foot was shattered. He had cuts to his head, hands, arms, torso, and legs. Any one of several wounds should have incapacitated him. Together, they should have killed him. The Germans left behind equipment that allowed French intelligence to estimate the size of the raiding party. They found several firearms, including automatic pistols. Based on blood trails, they determined Johnson had killed at least 4 German soldiers and wounded somewhere between 10 and 20 more. The action had lasted roughly 1 hour. 1 hour of sustained hand-to-hand combat. One man, armed eventually with only a knife, holding off more than 20 attackers. The French were astonished. On May 16th, just 1 day after the battle, they awarded both Johnson and Roberts the Croix de Guerre, France's highest military honor. Johnson's citation included the coveted gold palm, given only for extraordinary valor. He was one of the first Americans to receive this distinction. The citation read, "Henry Johnson gave a magnificent example of courage and energy." The French nicknamed him Black Death, a term of respect for his prowess in combat. To them, He was a warrior worthy of their highest honors. The story reached America through an article by journalist Irvin S. Cobb, published in the Saturday Evening Post on August 24, 1918. Cobb titled it, "Young Black Joe," and described the battle in vivid detail. The title itself reflected the casual racism of the era, diminishing Johnson even while praising him. But the content of the article made Johnson famous, at least temporarily. For a brief moment, America celebrated Henry Johnson. Former President Theodore Roosevelt, never one for understatement, called him one of the 5 bravest Americans to serve in World War I. The U.S. military immediately saw the propaganda value. They used Johnson's story for recruiting. His image appeared on posters encouraging Black Americans to enlist. His story was told in newspapers and magazines to prove that Black soldiers could fight, could be heroes, could serve with honor. When it served their purposes, when they needed Black bodies to fill quotas and replace casualties, the military celebrated him. "Look at Henry Johnson," they said. "See what a Black soldier can do. Come join the fight." But it was conditional. The praise came with unspoken limits. Johnson was allowed to be a hero as long as he remained an exceptional case, an outlier, not representative of what Black soldiers could achieve in general. He was allowed to be celebrated as long as he didn't demand that his heroism translate into equal rights. He was allowed to be praised as long as he stayed in his place. The 369th Infantry Regiment spent 191 continuous days on the front lines, longer than any other American unit in the war. Think about that. 191 days of constant danger, constant stress, constant death. They weren't cycled out for rest nearly as often as white American units. They were used hard, spent without regard for casualties, because to the white American command, Black soldiers were expendable. By the time the armistice was signed on November 11, 1918, the regiment had earned its nickname, the Harlem Hellfighters. More than 500 members of the regiment received the French Croix de Guerre. The French appreciated their sacrifice. The French honored their service. The French treated them as men. The Americans did not. When the 369th returned home in February 1919, they were greeted as heroes, at least temporarily. New York City gave them a parade up Fifth Avenue. Henry Johnson, promoted to sergeant, led his regiment. Still recovering from his wounds, unable to march because his shattered left foot would never fully heal, he rode in an open car, waving to the crowds, holding a bouquet of lilies that had been handed to him. Thousands lined the streets. For one day, the city celebrated these men. But there was a darker truth hiding beneath the pageantry. The 369th had their own parade because they weren't allowed to join the official victory parade with white American troops. Even in celebration, even after bleeding for their country, even after earning more medals than most white units, they had to be kept separate. The message was clear. You can die for America, but you can't march alongside white Americans. And then came the silence, the deliberate, systematic forgetting. The U.S. Army discharged Henry Johnson shortly after his return. His discharge papers made no mention of his wounds, no mention of his combat service, no mention of the night he held off 24 German soldiers, no mention of his French medals. As far as the official record was concerned, Henry Johnson had served without distinction. He was just another Black laborer who'd put on a uniform for a while. He received no disability pay despite his extensive injuries. He received no American medals, no recognition, nothing, no help finding work, no acknowledgement that his service had cost him his health, his ability to earn a living, his future. Why? The simplest answer is racism. But it went deeper than that. It was systematic, deliberate, policy-driven racism. The year 1919 saw a resurgence of white violence against Black Americans. The so-called Red Summer saw race riots across the country. White Americans, particularly in the South, were terrified of the idea of Black veterans returning home with combat experience, military training, and expectations of equal treatment. There was a deliberate effort to minimize and erase the contributions of Black soldiers, to prevent them from using their service as a claim to full citizenship. Henry Johnson had made the mistake of speaking honestly about his experiences. During a promotional speaking tour organized shortly after his return, he was sent to various cities to encourage Black Americans to buy war bonds and support the military. But Johnson, perhaps naively, perhaps courageously, told the truth. He detailed the discrimination Black troops faced during the war, how they'd been treated as servants rather than soldiers from the moment they arrived in France, how they'd been given inferior equipment, hand-me-down French rifles instead of American weapons, how white American officers had treated them with contempt, had assigned them to labor details instead of combat training, how General Pershing had tried to poison the French against them with his secret directive warning of their supposed inferiority. The tour was quickly shut down. The army didn't want those stories told. They wanted Black veterans to be grateful, to be quiet, to accept that their service, while appreciated in the abstract, didn't actually change anything about their status in American society. Johnson returned to Albany. His wounds prevented him from doing physical labor. His left foot, shattered by a German rifle butt, never healed properly. He walked with a limp and couldn't stand for long periods. That eliminated most of the jobs available to him. He couldn't work as a red-cap porter anymore, couldn't haul luggage up and down stairs. He couldn't do coal yard work. He couldn't do any of the hard physical labor that had been his means of survival before the war. He applied for jobs, but employers saw a wounded Black veteran and wanted nothing to do with him. Some feared he was dangerous, trained in violence, potentially unstable. Others simply didn't want to hire someone who couldn't work at full capacity, and many just didn't want to hire a Black man, wounded or not. He struggled to support himself. The Army's refusal to acknowledge his injuries meant he received no disability payments, no pension, no financial help of any kind. The man who had saved American lives, who had stopped a German raid, who had earned France's highest military honor, couldn't pay his rent. His wife, Edna, left him. The exact circumstances vary depending on the source, but the pattern is clear. Poverty destroys marriages. Hopelessness destroys marriages. Watching the man you married waste away, unable to work, unable to provide, unable to get the help he'd earned, that destroys marriages. She had to survive too. Johnson turned to alcohol, not for enjoyment, but for oblivion. To forget what he'd been in France and what he'd become in America. To dull the physical pain that never stopped. To silence the mental anguish of knowing his sacrifice had meant nothing to the country he'd bled for. By the late 1920s, the man who had been celebrated as a hero, whose face had appeared on recruiting posters, whose story had been told in national magazines, was living in poverty, alone, unable to work, forgotten by everyone except a few friends who remembered what he'd done. He was 36 years old, but the war had aged him decades. The wounds, the pain, the poverty, the alcohol, they'd all taken their toll. On July 1st, 1929, Henry Johnson died at Walter Reed Hospital in Washington, D.C. He was 36 years old. The official cause of death was myocarditis, a heart condition. But the real cause was neglect, poverty, and a nation's willful forgetting. His heart had literally been broken by what America had done to him. For decades, it was believed Henry Johnson had been buried in a pauper's grave in Albany, forgotten and unmarked. Even that indignity was based on incomplete information. In 2001, researchers discovered the truth. Johnson had been buried at Arlington National Cemetery with full military honors in July 1929. Someone, perhaps a sympathetic army officer, perhaps someone who knew his story, had arranged for him to be buried among heroes his family had never known. The information had never reached them. They'd believed for 72 years that he'd been dumped in an unmarked grave. He lay there, in America's most hallowed military cemetery, under the wrong name. His headstone read William Henry Johnson, the name on his birth records that he'd never used in life. Not the name he'd enlisted under, not the name he'd earned his medals under. His grave was visited by no one who knew his story, honored by no one who remembered his sacrifice. He was surrounded by heroes, but treated as if he were just another soldier. no different from anyone else. For more than 70 years, the United States government refused to properly recognize what Henry Johnson had done. They knew the story. The documentation existed. The French citations were in the files. The eyewitness accounts were recorded. The newspaper articles had been published. But acknowledging Johnson meant acknowledging that the army had failed him, had discriminated against him, had violated its obligations to him. Easier to just let him be forgotten. But some people remembered. Some people fought. In the 1990s, Herman Johnson, who for years believed he was Henry Johnson's son, began a campaign for recognition. Herman himself was a Tuskegee Airman, one of the famed black pilots of World War II who had broken their own barriers and fought their own battles against discrimination. He understood what his supposed father had faced. He understood the systematic denial of recognition, and he decided to do something about it. Herman pushed for the medals his father had been denied. He wrote letters to congressmen, senators, anyone who would listen. He contacted veterans organizations. He researched his father's service record, collecting every document, every newspaper article, every piece of evidence he could find. Later, in 2015, it was discovered through genealogical research that Herman wasn't actually related to Henry by blood. A clerical error or confusion with birth records had led him to believe Henry was his father. But by the time that truth emerged, it didn't matter. That family had adopted Henry's memory and fought for him when no one else would. They'd spent decades advocating for a man who turned out not to be their blood relative, and they didn't regret a moment of it. That's a different kind of heroism. New York Senator Charles Schumer took up the cause in the early 2000s. Schumer saw an injustice that could be corrected. He saw a story that deserved to be told, and he saw a pattern of discrimination that needed to be acknowledged. Albany veterans added their voices. The New York National Guard researched their own history and confirmed Johnson's service and his French medals. Slowly, painfully, the official record began to change. In 1996, President Bill Clinton awarded Henry Johnson a Purple Heart, 77 years after the fact. The Purple Heart is given to soldiers wounded in combat. Johnson had been wounded 21 times in combat. The fact that it took 77 years to give him this medal says everything about how the Army had treated him. In 2002, the U.S. Army awarded him the Distinguished Service Cross, the nation's second highest military honor, 83 years after the fact. The citation acknowledged his extraordinary heroism in close combat with an armed enemy. But the Medal of Honor, America's highest military decoration, remained out of reach. The Army's position was that too much time had passed, that the documentation wasn't sufficient, that they couldn't be certain of the details. This was absurd. The French had been certain enough in 1918 to give him their highest honor. Eyewitnesses had testified. Newspaper articles had been published contemporaneously. But the Army claimed they needed more evidence. Senator Schumer didn't give up. His staff dug deeper into the archives. They discovered a letter from General John J. Pershing himself, written shortly after the battle, acknowledging Johnson's extraordinary heroism. They found after-action reports from the 369th Infantry. They found the French citations, the original documents, not just references to them. The documentation was there. It had always been there. The Army had simply chosen to ignore it for nearly a century. Finally, on June 2, 2015, 97 years after the battle in the Argonne Forest, President Barack Obama presented the Medal of Honor. The ceremony took place at the White House, in the same room where other heroes had received their medals. By then, Herman Johnson had passed away in 2004. No direct descendants of Henry Johnson could be found. The genealogical research had determined that Henry had no children. The medal was accepted by Command Sergeant Major Louis Wilson of the New York Army National Guard, representing the unit Johnson had served with, the 369th Infantry Regiment, the Harlem Hellfighters. President Obama's remarks were direct. "We are a nation, a people, who remember our heroes. We never forget their sacrifice, and we believe it's never too late to say thank you." But it had been too late for Henry Johnson. He'd died in poverty 86 years earlier. He'd died forgotten. He died believing his country didn't care about his sacrifice. The recognition came when it couldn't matter to him anymore. It came when it couldn't change his life, couldn't give him back the years he'd lost, couldn't undo the poverty and pain and neglect. The Medal of Honor ceremony was attended by military dignitaries, New York politicians, historians, and representatives of the 369th Infantry Regiment. They honored his memory. They praised his service. They acknowledged the injustice. And then they all went home. And Henry Johnson was still dead, still had died penniless, still had been failed by his country. The story of Henry Johnson isn't just about one night in May 1918. It's about how America treats its heroes when those heroes are black. The same pattern repeated itself after World War II, Korea, Vietnam. Black soldiers served with distinction, earned medals for valor, came home to discrimination and denial. The 369th Infantry Regiment, the Harlem Hellfighters, helped change that. Not immediately, not easily, but they planted seeds. Their service, their sacrifice, their refusal to accept second-class status helped push America toward the civil rights movement. Every black soldier who followed walked paths these men had cleared. Today, Henry Johnson is properly honored. Fort Polk in Louisiana, a U.S. Army base, was renamed Fort Johnson in June 2023. The Sergeant Audie Murphy Club, established to honor exceptional non-commissioned officers, recognizes his standard of service. His story is taught in military history courses. His grave at Arlington National Cemetery is visited and honored. But we should remember what was lost. We should remember that for 97 years, America tried to forget this man, that he died without recognition, without the benefits he'd earned, without the respect he deserved, that it took nearly a century for the truth to be officially acknowledged. On that night in May 1918, Henry Johnson did something extraordinary. Wounded 21 times, armed only with a knife, he held off a superior force and saved his comrade's life. He earned the respect of France. He earned the praise of a former president. He earned medals and honors from a foreign nation that recognized his valor. His own country gave him nothing until he'd been dead for 67 years. The men of the 369th Infantry, the Harlem Hellfighters, spent 191 days on the front lines. They fought with courage. They earned hundreds of medals from France, and when they came home, they were told to go back to being second-class citizens, to forget what they'd proven, to accept their place. The French had treated them as men. America wanted them to go back to being boys, to being servants, to being invisible. Henry Johnson couldn't forget. He'd been something more in France. He'd been a soldier, a warrior, a man respected for what he could do rather than judged by the color of his skin. In France, when he walked down the street in his uniform with his Croix de Guerre on his chest, people saluted him. French citizens thanked him. French soldiers treated him as a comrade. For maybe the first time in his life, he'd been seen as a man, fully human, worthy of respect. Coming back to an America that wanted to pretend none of that had happened destroyed him. It wasn't just the physical wounds, though those were devastating enough. It was the psychological wound of being told that his sacrifice didn't matter, that his heroism was an inconvenience, that he should be grateful just to be allowed to exist in a country he'd nearly died defending. In 2018, on the 100th anniversary of the Battle of Henry Johnson, ceremonies were held in France and America. Veterans and historians gathered to honor his memory. French officials attended, acknowledging that their nation had recognized his valor a century ago, while America had failed him. The New York State Military Museum held special events. His story was finally being told accurately, completely, without the diminishment and dismissal that had characterized earlier tellings. The French ceremonies were particularly moving. French citizens and officials stood in the Argonne Forest, near where Johnson had fought, and honored his memory. They hadn't forgotten. They'd never forgotten. To them, Henry Johnson and the Harlem Hellfighters were heroes, full stop. No qualifications, no asterisks, just heroes. But the question remains, how many other Henry Johnsons are there? How many soldiers performed acts of extraordinary valor earned the respect of their comrades and their enemies, and then had their stories deliberately erased because of the color of their skin. How many died forgotten, their sacrifice unrecognized, their names lost to history? The answer is hundreds, thousands. The documentation exists. Historians have found the records. Medal of Honor recommendations that were denied, valor citations that were downgraded or disappeared, black soldiers who saved white soldiers' lives but received no recognition because acknowledging them would mean treating them as equals. The systematic denial of recognition to black soldiers wasn't an accident. It was policy. The U.S. Army's official citation for Henry Johnson's Medal of Honor reads, "Private Henry Johnson distinguished himself by extraordinary acts of heroism at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty while serving as a member of Company C, 369 Infantry Regiment, 93rd Infantry Division, American Expeditionary Forces on May 15, 1918, during combat operations against the enemy on the front lines of the Western Front in France." It goes on to detail his actions, his wounds, his rescue of his fellow soldier. It acknowledges what the French had recognized in 1918. It says what should have been said in 1919. Every word is true. Every word is accurate. And every word came 97 years too late. Those words, written in 2015, couldn't bring Henry Johnson back, couldn't give him the life he deserved, couldn't give him the medical care he needed, couldn't give him the ability to work and support himself, couldn't give him back his marriage, couldn't give him back his health, couldn't undo 36 years of struggle and 86 years of obscurity. They're important words, necessary words, words that needed to be said, but they came 97 years too late to matter to the man they honored. Henry Johnson died believing his country had forgotten him, and he was right. For most of a century, America chose to forget, chose to erase, chose to pretend that his sacrifice, and the sacrifice of thousands of black soldiers like him, didn't matter as much as the sacrifice of white soldiers, that their heroism was somehow less worthy of recognition, that their wounds were less deserving of treatment, that their service was less valuable. Today we remember, not because it was easy, not because it came naturally, not because America's institutions spontaneously decided to do the right thing, but because people like Herman Johnson, like Senator Schumer, like the veterans of the 369, like historians and activists and ordinary citizens who cared about justice, refused to let the story die. They fought for decades to make America acknowledge what it had tried to forget. They wouldn't give up. They wouldn't be silent. They demanded that the truth be told. The story of Henry Johnson isn't a feel-good tale of eventual justice. It's a tragedy. A man who gave everything, received nothing, and died broken. The medals that came later, the recognition that finally arrived, the honors that were posthumously bestowed, they don't change that. They can't undo what was done to him. They can't give him back his life. They can't repair the damage. They're acknowledgments of guilt, admissions that America failed him, but they're not redemption. But they can remind us. They can make sure that his story and the stories of the Harlem Hellfighters remain part of our history, not hidden, not erased, not forgotten again. They can serve as a warning about what happens when we allow discrimination and prejudice to override justice and honor. They can teach us that the fight for recognition, for respect, for basic human dignity is never finished, because there are always people and institutions that would prefer to forget uncomfortable truths. On the night of May 15th, 1918, a 5'4" railroad porter from Albany, New York, became one of the bravest soldiers America ever produced. He fought for an hour with 21 wounds in his body. He refused to quit. He refused to surrender. He refused to abandon his comrade. He stopped a German raid that could have compromised American positions. He earned the respect of the French army. He earned France's highest military honor. He earned his place among history's greatest warriors. And then he came home to a country that pretended it had never happened, that discharged him without acknowledgement, that denied him medical care, that let him struggle in poverty, That let him die alone and forgotten at age 36. That's the real story of Henry Johnson. Not just what he did in the Argonne Forest, but what America did to him afterward. Both parts matter. Both parts are true. Both parts need to be remembered, because remembering what he did honors his courage, but remembering what was done to him honors the truth. And without truth, honor means nothing. He deserved better. He earned better. He should have received better. The fact that recognition finally came, 97 years late, doesn't change the fundamental injustice of his story. It acknowledges it, it admits it, but it doesn't fix it. Nothing can fix it. Henry Johnson is dead. He died poor. He died forgotten. And all the medals and ceremonies and honors in the world can't change that. What we can do is remember. Remember his courage. Remember his sacrifice. And remember what his country did to him, so we can try to do better for the soldiers who serve today. So we can recognize the ongoing patterns of discrimination that still affect veterans, especially veterans of color. So we can acknowledge that the fight for equal recognition and equal treatment is still being waged, more than a century after Henry Johnson fought his battle in the Argonne Forest. That's what we owe him. Not just remembrance of his heroism, but recognition of the injustice. Not just celebration of what he did, but acknowledgement of what was done to him. Both truths, together always.